أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So in the previous lessons we started looking at the description of the prayer. We did the opening section, Takbiratul Ihram, when you begin the prayer, what you recite at the beginning, then about the Fatiha and the rulings on the recitation of the Fatiha and the different opinions as to whether you have to recite it or not. So you remember there are three circumstances you could be in when you're praying. Either you're praying by yourself, or you are praying as the Imam, or you are praying in the congregation. If you're by yourself or as the Imam, you must read the Fatiha by consensus, agreement. But if you are in the Jama'ah, in the congregation, then that is the difference of opinion. Some scholars say you must, others they say that you don't have to, and there was an opinion that in the loud prayers you don't, but in the quiet prayers you have to. And then after the Fatiha there was the statement Ameen that is said out loud as well. And then after that you recite whatever you are able from the Quran, and that's the section we were on, talking about the recitation of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the different prayers. So firstly then, in the Fajr prayer, what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to recite in the Fajr prayer? There's a hadith in Al-Bukhari and Muslim of Abu Barzah al-Aslami radiyallahu anhu قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقرأ في الفجر ما بين 60 إلى 100 آية. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم in the Fajr prayer would recite 60 to 100 ayahs. 60 to 100 ayahs in the Fajr prayer. And in a version of Al-Bukhari, وَكَانَ يَقْرَأُ فِي رَكَعَتَيْنِ أَوْ إِحْدَاهُمَا مَا بَيْنَ 60 إِلَى 100. That the Prophet ﷺ used to read in the two rak'ahs of Fajr combined, or it says in the narration, maybe the meaning is in just one rak'ah, meaning per rak'ah, 60 to 100 ayahs. So this narration or these narrations indicate both possibilities. That the Messenger used to recite between 60 to 100 ayahs between the two rak'ahs of Fajr. So if you go to the maximum of 100, that would mean 50 ayahs per rak'ah. But the other narration here says, أَوْ إِحْدَاهُمَا, that possibly the Prophet ﷺ used to read between 60 and 100 ayahs in each rak'ah of the Fajr prayer. In any case, the point here is that the recitation in the Fajr prayer is supposed to be long. It is supposed to be longer than the other prayers. It is only 2 rak'at, and so that's why the recitation is longer, in order for that prayer to be longer like the 4 rak'at prayers. And then it's also mentioned in some examples exact surahs that the Prophet ﷺ used to sometimes read. It says in the hadith of Sahih Muslim of Jabir ibn Samurah radiyallahu anhu, قال إن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يقرأ في الفجر بقاف والقرآن المجيد وفي رواية بقاف والقرآن. So it mentions in this hadith that the Prophet ﷺ used to read in the Fajr prayer Surah Qaf as an example. Surah Qaf as an example. And in the version of Al-Imam Ahmad, he said, Bil Waqi'ah, Suratul Waqi'ah, that he used to recite that in the Fajr. And there are many examples here. In fact, there are quite a few different hadith telling us about the different surahs that the Prophet ﷺ would use or would recite in the Fajr prayer. It mentions أنه صلى صلاة الصبح فقرأ الروم فالتبس عليه. Surah Al-Rum as an example. And وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا عَسْعَسْ. And also إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. All of these are examples of the different types of surahs that the Prophet ﷺ used to read in the Fajr prayer. Then after that, the Dhuhr prayer. What did the Prophet ﷺ used to read in the Dhuhr prayer? It mentions in a hadith in Sahih Muslim أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يقرأ في صلاة الظهر في الركعتين الأوليين في كل ركعة قدر 30 آية وفي الأخريين قدر 15 آية. In this narration it says that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to read the amount equivalent to 30 ayahs in the first two rak'ahs. 30 ayat, that amount approximately in the first two rak'at of Salatul Dhuhr. And in the second two, meaning the third and the fourth rak'ah, he would recite half of that, 15 ayat worth. فكان يقرأ في صلاة الظهر في الركعتين الأوليين في كل ركعة قدر 30 آية وفي الأخريين قدر 15 آية. And in other narrations it tells us some more of the details. لقد كانت صلاة الظهر تقام فيذهب الذاهب إلى البقيع فيقضي حاجته ثم يتوضأ ثم يأتي ورسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في الركعة الأولى مما يطولها. It mentions in this hadith that a person would sometimes go to Baqi', which is the graveyard next to the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when the Dhuhr prayer started, somebody may go out to Baqi', take care of his need, make wudu, and come back into the mosque, and the Prophet would still be on the first raka'ah of Dhuhr yet. So he would recite a reasonable amount in the first raka'ah of Dhuhr. Some of the examples, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى, he may recite that, or سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى, he may recite that. Those are some of the examples of what the Messenger may recite in Salatul Dhuhr. On a Friday, of course, there is no Dhuhr, there is the Jum'ah prayer instead. So there are some narrations about what the Prophet ﷺ used to recite in the Jum'ah prayer too. In the Jum'ah prayer, it's mentioned, Abu Huraira says, إني سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقرأ بهما يوم الجمعة. يعني في الجمعة في الركعة الأولى والمنافقين في الركعة الثانية. So it mentions in this narration that the Prophet ﷺ would recite Surah Al-Munafiqeen and Al-Jum'ah in the Jum'ah prayer. Al-Jum'ah first and then Al-Munafiqeen in the second raka'ah. That is one example. And of course you have سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى in the first raka'ah and هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ الْغَاشِيَةِ in the second raka'ah. That is also what the Prophet ﷺ used to recite in the Jum'ah prayer. The Maghrib prayer, like we said, that is kept shorter. And so the Messenger used to recite shorter chapters in the Maghrib prayer. In the hadith of Marwan ibn al-Hakam in al-Bukhari, he says, قال لي زيد بن ثابت. Zayd ibn Thabit said to me, ما لك تقرأ في المغرب بقصار? That how come you read the short surahs in Maghrib? بقصار المفصل وقد سمعت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقرأ بطول الطوليين. He said, how come you recite the short ones in Salat al-Maghrib? How come you recite the short ones in the Maghrib prayer? And the Prophet ﷺ used to recite the longer of the two. And also in some narrations, أتقرأ في المغرب بقل هو الله أحد, in the Maghrib prayer. And إنا أعطيناك الكوثر, in the Maghrib prayer. قال نعم قال فمحلوفة لقد رأيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقرأ فيها بأطول الطولين ألف لام ميم صاد. There are some narrations where the Messenger read longer chapters, but as we said, the general sunnah is that it is the shorter chapters that are read in the Maghrib prayer. And then the Isha prayer, Abu Rafi' mentions in a hadith, صليت مع أبي هريرة العتمة فقرأ إذا السماء انشقت. That was an example of a surah that the Prophet ﷺ read in the Isha prayer, إذا السماء انشقت. And then there is the hadith about Mu'adh ibn Jabal. كان معاذ ابن جبل يصلي مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ثم يرجع فيؤم قومه. Mu'adh ibn Jabal used to come to the mosque of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم and read behind the messenger, in the jama'ah behind the messenger. Then Mu'adh ibn Jabal would go back to his area, in whichever area of Medina he lived in, and he was the imam in his area. So he would then get back in time to lead them, his people, in the Isha prayer. فَصَلَّى الْعِشَاء فَقَرَأَ بِالْبَقَرَةِ, and he would recite Surah Al-Baqarah. فَانْصَرَفَ الرَّجُلُ, so a man broke away from the prayer and went, because it was too long. فَكَأَنَّ مُعَاذًا تَنَاوَلَ مِنْهُ, and it mentions that maybe Mu'adh ibn Jabal reprimanded him or said something to him for that. فَبَلَغَ النَّبِيَّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ, so then the Prophet ﷺ found out about that incident. فَقَالْ فَتَّان, that this is like we would say these days, troublemaking, meaning that Mu'adh ibn Jabal was reading chapters that were too long, reciting Surah Al-Baqarah in the Isha prayer, which makes it very long, of course. And so as a consequence, that man had become agitated, or he couldn't stay that long, he had broken away. And when the Prophet ﷺ found out, he basically admonished Mu'adh ibn Jabal and told him to pray shorter ones, and the Messenger gave him examples. He said, فَلَوْلَا صَلَّيْتَ بِسَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى. If only you had read سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى. If only you had read those chapters instead of Surah Al-Baqarah, then that would have been better. Page 98. وفي رواية اقرأ والشمس وضحاها وسبح اسم ربك الأعلى. In another version, the Messenger said, read وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا and سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى. Those are the appropriate kinds of lengths. In another narration, إِذَا السَّمَاءُ انْفَطَرَتْ So those are the medium kind of length, appropriate kind of length to read in the Isha prayer. There are other sunnah things to remember when leading the prayer. A person may be leading the prayer, then something happens during the prayer that necessitates shortening the prayer. Or maybe, in other words, not making it long, making it shorter. And if that is needed, then the Imam can shorten his recitation, stop earlier than what he would have recited or had planned to recite in order to make the prayer quicker. There's an example of that in the hadith in Al-Bukhari from Abu Qatada radiyallahu anhu عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إني لأقوم في الصلاة أريد أن أطول فيها. That the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that sometimes I stand in the prayer to lead the prayer and I want to extend it. I want to make it long. فَأَسْمَعُ بُكَاءَ الصَّبِيِّ. But I hear the crying of a child in that congregation somewhere. فَأَتَجَوَّزُ فِي صَلَاتِي كَرَاهِيَّةَ أَنْ أَشُقَّ عَلَى أُمَّةِ. He said, so in that case, if I hear that in the congregation a young child crying, I will then shorten the prayer, meaning I'll only recite a little bit as opposed to more ayat or longer surahs I had planned or wanted to. I'll recite something short instead to make the prayer quicker so that I do not burden the mother of that child. So that is in the sunnah, the Imam can shorten the prayer if there is some need or something arises, like the crying of a child within that congregation, so as not to burden the mother. Also, is it allowed, so far we've mentioned all of the chapters the Messenger used to recite in the different prayers, but is it allowed to read one chapter split over 2 rak'ahs? Like for example, a person reads إِذَا السَّمَاءُ فَطَرَتْ, reads half of it in the first rak'ah and the second half of it in the second rak'ah. Is it allowed to split up chapters like that, half and half? It is allowed. There's nothing prohibiting that action. A person can recite a portion of a chapter in the first rak'ah and a portion of it in the second rak'ah. That is possible and is permissible. Even though they say it was not really the action of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he would recite full chapters. And it's not really known from the Messenger as such that he would break up the chapters. But it's allowed, it is permissible. Especially when it comes to the long chapters, like Surah Al-Baqarah, the scholars, they say, it is permissible for you to recite selected verses, selected ayat from Surah Al-Baqarah in the first rak'ah and then in the second rak'ah. But should they be in order? If you select a section of Surah Al-Baqarah to recite in the first rak'ah, and then you select another section of Surah Al-Baqarah for the second rak'ah, should they be in order? Meaning the section that you select for the first rak'ah should come first in Surah Al-Baqarah, and the section that you select for the second rak'ah should come later in Surah Al-Baqarah. Or are you allowed to select a section from the end of Baqarah for the first rak'ah, and then select a section from the beginning of Baqarah for your second rak'ah? Generally, scholars, they say you should keep it in order, generally. But it is, again, permissible to do it in the mixed up way as long as each section makes sense in and of itself. So if you have a section from the end of Surah Al-Baqarah, a few ayat, and they are within themselves, they make sense within themselves, and then you have a few ayat from the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, they make sense within themselves, it's possible you could recite the end ones in your first rak'ah and the first ones in your second one. Possible, but not something you would really do. It makes more sense to keep things in order as you recite. So they say these kinds of things are not really witnessed much in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, breaking up chapters and reading sections. The Messenger generally used to read full chapters when reciting in the prayer, but it is something permissible to read sections of the chapters. Imagine you pick a chapter in the first raka'ah. إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا, for example. And then in the second raka'ah, وَلَا الضَّالِينَ آمِينَ إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا. You start reciting the same chapter again. Can you recite the same chapter in both raka'ahs? Is it permissible to recite the same chapter in both raka'ahs of the prayer? Permissible. It is permissible to do so. There's no prohibition on that. The prayer would be valid. It is permissible to recite the same chapter in both of the raka'ahs. Zalzala, it's mentioned in the hadith of Abu Dawood that the Prophet ﷺ did read إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا in both raka'at of a Fajr prayer that he led. That is mentioned in Sunan Abi Dawood. Sheikh Uthaymeen mentions one last point here before moving on to the next section. The next section, of course, is then going into ruku'. But before going into the ruku', the Sheikh says, the issue of how you actually stand. The hand, right hand on top of the left hand, we already discussed previously. There are narrations talking about it being on the chest, narrations about on the stomach, narrations even below the belly button. And there are differences between the scholars about the levels of authenticity of all of those narrations. Some of the scholars, they say the narrations that say put your hands, the right one on top of the left one, below the belly button, are weak narrations. And they say the one about right hand on top of the left hand on the chest or just below the chest are the strong narrations. You have differences of opinion on that. It's not something that is definitive to one opinion or one statement only. Yes, many scholars, they say it seems to be the strongest narration that they go on the chest. But that's all it is. It seems to be the strongest narration. If a person puts them on his stomach, it's legitimate and valid. Legitimate and valid, and there's no problem. There are narrations. And that is still implementing the sunnah. Right hand on top of the left hand over the stomach area would be completely valid, not an issue in that. So there is no definitive one position that this is the strong narration, has to be on the chest. Yes, that appears to be the strongest narration, as many scholars say. But if a person put his hands on his stomach, right hand on top of his left, it's not something to argue over as such. Even if a person was right above the belly button, it's still not really an issue of argumentation as such. It's not one of those where it's a bid'ah if you put your hands too low down. There are narrations mentioning it there. Sheikh al-Fawzan, if you ask him, he says no problem. Here, higher on the chest, lower near the belly button, he says no problem. And that is what many of the scholars, they say, that it's within that range. And yes, some may say the strongest evidence says the chest, so just stick to that. But if a person had his hands lower, it's not an issue of argumentation. That we already did though. What about now the rest of your standing position? So you're standing, where should your legs or how should your legs be placed? Your feet, how should they be placed? You see some people praying and their feet are right next to each other. Right next to each other. You flick them and they would fall. Their feet right next to each other when they stand and pray. Others maybe extremely wide apart. Where are your feet supposed to be? What is the gap? What is the positioning? Sheikh Uthaymeen says, يَكُونُ طَبِيعِيًّا, that you stand in your natural state. How do you know what a natural state is? Very simple. When you stand up, someone now, if we say stand up, and you stand up, without thinking, the default of your stance is your natural state. Nobody's going to stand up now if I say you stand up, you stand up. Nobody's going to stand up and then put their feet together. You don't stand up like that. Nobody's going to stand up and then spread their feet apart. Nobody does that. If somebody says to you stand up, you're just going to stand up and your feet are going to be in their natural positioning, which is basically down the line of your body. Basically down the line of your body. Right foot, left foot, straight down the line of the body, right side and left side. Not joined together, not split apart. So the feet should be in that natural position, not joined and not split. Because there is no specific narration about the exact positioning of the Prophet ﷺ about the feet. So what is understood therefore is that the feet are simply positioned in the natural position. They are put down in the natural position. But then there is a question. لكن الصحابة رضي الله عنهم كان أحدهم يلزق كعبه بكعب صاحبه من أجل تسوية الصف. The companions, they would join their ankles together to straighten the row, because that is one of the ways you can straighten the row, by joining the ankle to the ankle of the person next to you. Then the row will become straight. So they used to do that, joining the ankle to the ankle to make the row straight. And that is something important to remember as well. When straightening the row, it is straightened off the heels of the ankles. The row is not straightened up on the toes, which is what many people do. When they are lining up and straightening the row, everybody lines up by looking ahead of themselves. They look forward to the left and forward to the right to make sure everybody's feet are lined up at the front onto the row. And that's incorrect, because some people, they may have size 12 feet and others may be size 4. So if you're all lined up at the front, then your backs are all going to be zigzag at the back, depending on how big your feet are, what size your feet are. So that isn't a straight row then. It's not lined up and straightened up on the toes. It's lined up at the back, on the heels. So to line up the row, you're supposed to look behind. Look behind you on the right and behind you on the left to make sure all of the heels and the ankles are all lined up, regardless of where the front of the foot ends up. That is the method of straightening the row. But many people, they make a mistake straightening the row. They look at the front. They look left and right ahead of them to see if it's straight. You can't see if it's straight there. You have to look behind to see that the backs are all lined up and the heels are all lined up. That's the straightening of the row. So that is important to remember in the method of how the row is straightened up. It is the ankle that is given the precedence. The ankle is the key point. That is how it lines up the row. Then after that, we go on to the ruku'. The ruku' then, بعد انتهاء القراءة يكبر رافعا يديه كرفعهما عند تكبيرة الإحرام فيركع. So after you finished all your recitation, then you raise your hands just like you did for the opening takbir, and we went through all those details about where to raise the hands exactly, up to here, up to here. We did all that at the beginning. The same method now, raise your hands upon that same method. Say Allahu Akbar and then bend down into the ruku' position. It's mentioned that you say Allahu Akbar when you go into the ruku' position. There is a hadith that says every time the Prophet ﷺ went down into a position in the prayer or came up from a position in the prayer, he would say Allahu Akbar. Every descent and every ascent within the prayer, every time he went down into a position or came up from a position, he would say Allahu Akbar. So going down into ruku', Allahu Akbar. Rising up, Sami Allahu liman hamida. But then Allahu Akbar to go down into prostration, Allahu Akbar to come up, Allahu Akbar to go down, Allahu Akbar to stand up, Allahu Akbar in every one of those movements going up and down, with the exception of Sami Allahu liman hamida, which is mentioned specifically in the Sunnah. So it's mentioned in the hadith of Al-Bukhari from Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma, أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يرفع يديه حذو منكبيه إذا افتتح الصلاة وإذا كبر للركوع. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to raise his hands level with his shoulders when he used to do the opening takbir, and also when he used to go down into ruku'. وَإِذَا رَفَعَ رَأْسَهُ مِنَ الرُّكُوعِ, and when he used to come out of the ruku' back to the level of his shoulders again, رَفَعَهُمَا كَذَلِكَ أَيْضًا وَقَالَ, and he would say, coming out of the ruku' سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَهُ رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ وَكَانَ لَا يَفْعَلُ ذَلِكَ فِي السُّجُودِ. So when coming up from the ruku' سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَهُ رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ, but that was only coming out of the ruku', not in the prostrations. In the prostrations coming up and down, it is Allahu Akbar. وَلَا يَفْعَلُ ذَلِكَ حِينَ يَسْجُدُ وَلَا حِينَ يَرْفَعُ رَأْسَهُ مِنَ السُّجُودِ. Now then, so when you finish وَلَا الضَّالِينَ آمين, Allahu Akbar, down into ruku'. What is the exact position of your body in ruku'? How are you supposed to do that ruku' position exactly? There are a few points to remember. One, يَمُدُّ ظَهْرَهُ يَحْصِرُهُ فَلَا يُقَوِّسُهُ. When you go down into ruku', you are supposed to make your back straight. Going down into ruku', your back is supposed to be straight, stretched out, straight, not in any curved position. It is not supposed to be curved, bending down or bending upwards. Some people, they go so far down, the back bends like this. Not that way, nor that way. Back is not supposed to be bent. When you go down into ruku', your back is supposed to be stretched out and straight. That's one. Second point, يجعل رأسه حيال ظهره أي لا ينزله ولا يرفعه بل يكون الظهر مستويا مع رأسه. Your head is supposed to be in line with your back. So if somebody looked at you from the side, you would be a straight line. Your back and then your head all lined up together. So a person's head is not supposed to be above their back. Neither are you supposed to bend down and then your head, you bend it even further down. That's incorrect. The head straight along with the back, all lined up straight. The back and the head. Thirdly, يجافي عضديه عن جنبيه. Your arms are not supposed to be, so your hands are obviously on your knees, but your arms are not supposed to be stuck next to you. Your arms are supposed to be out. They are supposed to be away from your body with a gap under your arms. Away from your body with a gap under your arms. When you go down into the ruku', they are not supposed to be stuck together next to your body, at the side of your body, but away from your body. Hands on the knees and arms out, away from the body. Number 4, يضع كفيه على ركبتيه مفرجة الأصابع كالقابض عليهما أي على ركبتين. The hands go on to the knees and your fingers are supposed to be out. They're not supposed to be together. When you get hold of your knees, you don't get hold of your knee with fingers all together. The fingers are supposed to be spread. When you hold your knee, fingers spread, not fingers joined together like that, but spread when you get hold of the knees. So hold your knees with your fingers spread, holding on to them, like grabbing onto them, onto your knees. So it's not just touching your knees, but it's actually like grabbing onto your knees, grabbing onto the knees with your hands. And number 5, يكون وضع الرجلين كحال القيام. The positioning of your feet doesn't change from where they were when you were standing up. They are going to be down in line with your body, going down the sides, matching up with the rest of your body, not together, not spread out, down in a straight line from where they were before. All of that is mentioned in the hadith about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam doing the ruku'. It mentions وَإِذَا رَكَعَ أَمْكَنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنْ رُكْبَتَيْهِ ثُمَّ حَصَرَ ظَهْرَهُ. That when the Prophet ﷺ did the ruku', he would put his hands on his knees and he would straighten out his back and his head all lined up together. وَكَانَ إِذَا رَكَعَ لَمْ يُشْخِصْ رَأْسَهُ وَلَمْ يُصَوِّبْهُ أي لم يرفعه ولكن بين ذلك. In the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha in Sahih Muslim, she says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam never used to lower his head nor raise his head in the ruku'. So when you go down, your back is straight, but your head at the end shouldn't be looking up with your back straight, the rest of it. Neither should you go into ruku' with your back straight and then your head bent down. Rather, the head is in line. So it's clear in the hadith of Aisha, the Prophet never used to lower his head, nor did he used to raise his head. It was lined up straight with his back. In another hadith, فَلَمَّا رَكَعَ وَضَعَ رَاحَتَيْهِ عَلَى رُكْبَتَيْهِ. When he went into the ruku', he put his palms onto his knees. وَجَعَلَ أَصَابِعَهُ أَسْفَلَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. And his fingers were below the knees. So the fingers, the palm of your hand grabs the knee itself, and then the fingers are below the knee. The palm goes right onto the knee, and the fingers are then below the knee. That is the way that the Prophet ﷺ used to hold on to his knees in the ruku'. وَجَافَى بِمِرْفَقَيْهِ حَتَّى اسْتَوَى كُلُّ شَيْءٍ مِّنْهُ. And his elbows, it mentions in this hadith, he would split them away from his body. The elbows would be split away from the body, a gap underneath, when holding on to the knees until you become that straight lined up position, with the back lined up at that angle. Then what does a person actually say? يقول في حال ركوعه سبحان ربي العظيم. سبحان ربي العظيم. That is the statement that a person makes in the ruku', and that is based upon the hadith. لما نزلت فسبح باسم ربك العظيم. That glorify the name of your Lord the most great. The Prophet ﷺ said about that, اجعلوها في ركوعكم. Do that in your ruku'. Meaning, as they say in simple terms, glorify the name of your Lord the greatest, which is Subhana Rabbi al-Azim. Glorification of my Lord the greatest. Subhana Rabbi al-Azim. And then when the chapter was revealed or the surah was revealed, Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la. Glorify the name of your Lord the Most High. The Prophet ﷺ said about that ayah, اجعلوها في سجودكم. Make that, do that in your prostrations. So in the prostration you say, Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. So there is a clear hadith where the Messenger said in the ruku', do the glorification of your Lord the greatest, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, and the glorification of Allah the Most High in the prostration, Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. So a person says that, and the minimum that it should be repeated for perfection is 3 times. The minimum it should be repeated for perfection is 3 times. And it mentions أَعْلَاهُ لِلْإِمَامِ عَشَرًا. If you're the imam leading the prayer, you should not repeat it more than 10 times. 10 times. Then after that, Sami Allahu liman hamida, come up. You don't extend it beyond that if you're the imam. But if you're praying by yourself, you can do it as many times as you like. You can go beyond the 10. Also, a person can add on certain other types of supplications. They are mentioned in the Sunnah, can also be read and added on. Subhanaka Allahumma Rabbana wa bihamdika Allahumma ighfirli, as an example. And Subhanaka Allahumma Rabbana wa bihamdika Allahumma ighfirli. It says in the hadith of Aisha in Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ used to add this in his ruku' and in his prostration. Subhanaka Allahumma Rabbana wa bihamdika Allahumma ighfirli. That glorified be you, O Allah, our Lord, and your praise, and great be your praise, O Allah, forgive me. So that can also be added into the ruku' and into the prostration. And as you know, of course, in the prostration you can then even add du'as personally, your personal du'as, and they can be in another language too if you cannot speak Arabic. Besides these du'as then in the ruku', we're in the ruku' yet. Besides these du'as, you are not supposed to recite Quran though. You are not supposed to recite Quran in the ruku'. And there is a hadith about that. أَلَا وَإِنِّي نُهِيتُ أَنْ أَقْرَأَ الْقُرْآنَ رَاكِعًا أَوْ سَاجِدًا. The Messenger said, I have been prohibited from reciting the Quran in ruku' and in prostration. So it is impermissible to recite the Quran in the ruku' and in the prostration. In the prostration though, you might be able to recite the Quran in one circumstance, and that is if it's a dua. If it's a dua, some type of dua which happens to be an ayah of the Quran, then you can read that in the prostration for the sake of it being a dua, not for the sake of reciting the Quran. Like رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ, for example. It's a dua, but it's an ayah of the Quran. You could read that in prostration if you intend by it as the dua and the meaning of it as a dua, not as recitation of the Quran. Then after a person does his reading in the ruku', then what do you say as you rise up from the ruku'? Sheikh Uthaymeen says, ثُمَّ يَرْفَعُ رَأْسَهُ وَيَدَيْهِ كَرَفْعِهِمَا عِنْدَ الرُّكُوعِ وَعِنْدَ تَكْبِيرَةِ الْإِحْرَامِ قَائِلًا فِي حَالِ الرَّفْعِ. So as you are rising up from the ruku', you raise your hands just like you did before for the opening takbir. And as you are rising, you say, سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَهُ. Allah hears the one who praises him. سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَهُ. Allah hears the one who praises him. And that is also in some of the ahadith that when the Prophet ﷺ used to raise up, he used to say that. Hadith of Ibn Umar, Malik ibn al-Huwayrith in Al-Bukhari. Then when you rise up, after saying Sami'a Allahu liman hamida, you then are supposed to be in a fully upright standing position. As you are rising up, you're saying Sami'a Allahu liman hamida. And now at the end of saying it, you are in a fully upright standing up position. At that position, when you are now fully upright and standing, you say the part Rabbana wa lakal hamd. Rabbana wa lakal hamd. When you get to the standing up position, Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah. Rabbana wa lakal hamd. That's how the scholars explain it. And when you are in that standing up position, it is required that you, as they say, settle yourself in that position. Meaning you don't come out of ruku' and then instantly back down into prostration. You come out of the ruku' and then momentarily pause to settle yourself in that position. To be settled, comfortable in that position, then you move on to the next position. That is known as at-tuma'nina. At-tuma'nina, that settlement in the positions. So each position of the prayer, you have to stop and be settled in that position, then move on to the next one. The mistake is people clearly do not settle into the position. They come up, down, barely finishing one movement, starting the next one straight away. So that is a mistake. You're supposed to finish one movement, settle there, then go into the next movement. So here with the ruku', you come up, stand, be settled, and then go down into the prostration after that. And then also it mentions, you say, Sami'a Allahu liman hamida, when you rise up, and then when you are standing up, you say, Rabbana lakal hamd. And you can say other versions, Allahumma Rabbana lakal hamd, Allahumma Rabbana wa lakal hamd. There are some little wording differences, and all of those are allowed to be said. And when the Imam says, Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah, that we were talking about when you're praying by yourself. But when the Imam is leading you and he says, Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah, then you are supposed to read after that, Rabbana lakal hamd, or Allahumma Rabbana lakal hamd. That is after the Imam says, Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah. There are other du'as that can be read as well at that time. There are many other du'as, and you can check those du'as in Fortress of the Muslim and books like that. They can be seen there. But we'll stop there for today then, and insha'Allah ta'ala, we'll carry on with this next section from next week, which is basically almost coming up now to the prostration section. We'll continue from that next week insha'Allah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.